Welcome to a video tutorial on Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, his novel that's referred to as a novel about the lost generation, a Gertrude Stein quote. The way I organized the course was I put Sun Also Rises as the third text in the course, really, with In Our Time in 1925, and then we went to Farewell to Arms, the great World War I novel, where Frederick Henry falls in love with Lady Brett, with Catherine Barclay. And then I followed those two texts with The Sun Also Rises because this is really a post-World War I. Some of the characters in this novel are soldiers who've been wounded at the war. If they haven't been wounded physically like Jake Barnes has, he's been emasculated, he was wounded in the groin. They've been wounded psychologically. And so they are drifting through Paris and Spain and Versailles, looking for something to do with their lives. They're unsure about going back to America. They don't really have a purpose after the war. They're disillusioned with institutions. They're disillusioned with the world. And this book is really about failed relationships and the inability of post-World War I men really to handle relationships well. And so this picture here of Hemingway and some of his compatriots writing in Paris, I think is a good place to start, because Hemingway himself, in his first marriage, went to Paris, married a wealthy woman, and they were able to live humbly in Paris, but they were able to live abroad, and it's where Hemingway created some of his best writing. Let's look at some of the essential questions that are going to inform this novel. So, what are the informing principles of the lost generation? What does it mean to be of the lost generation? In other words, those who do not have a guiding principles to live by. And really, this book is about uncoded people. What are the causes of the faithlessness of the lost generation? Clearly, war is part of it, but you'll see that there's quote-unquote injustice everywhere, both during the war and after the war. And then what does it mean to live without a code is a question that we're going to look at. Without a faith in the world, without a belief in the self. We're going to meet some characters who we're going to loathe, but we're going to loathe because they live their lives without a code. And then, the final two positive questions: how does one get strong in the broken places? The world's going to destroy you, as we know from the Old Man and the Sea. But you need to get strong in the places where the world breaks you. If the relationship fails, you can't give up on love. You got to find another love in which you can get learn to love again and learn to be strong with respect to being faithful to and in love. And then how does Jake Barnes, our main character, set out to live in this world that destroys you and learn from that what life is all about? So lots of interesting things, lots of sort of umbrella questions to think about. We'll come back to those as we go. But here's a great quote, not from The Sun Also Rises, but it's something he wrote in a letter. Hemingway said, "There are some things that cannot be learned quickly, and time must be paid for their acquiring. They're the very simplest things, and because it takes a man's life to know them, the little new that each man gets from life is very costly and the only heritage he has to leave." I think this is a great quote to begin our discussion, our thinking about The Sun Also Rises. We're going to meet some individuals post-World War I, Europe, floating around, drinking too much, having too much sex with too many partners, and living this life of just irresponsibility, you could argue immorality, and they have no real direction. And so, one of the simplest things that I think Hemingway is getting at, that takes a lifetime to learn, is to be able to live by your own code, by being able to follow the principles that you self-impose upon yourself. And it takes a whole life to know the simplest things. And I think he wrote this novel to show us some of the things that cannot be learned quickly, but we can experience the failures of others and avoid them. And he also has some great coded characters in this novel that we're going to look at. The other great epigraph in the beyond you're all a lost generation, is this from Ecclesiastes, and this is actually ironically on Silver Creek. It's a plaque that says this, and so, this is a lost generation, but this one generation passeth away, another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever, the sun also rises, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth the place where he rose, the wind goeth toward the south, and turneth to the north, and whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. So there's a wholeness here. This is obviously excerpted from the Bible, but there's a wholeness here in creation. There's a cycle here, the water cycle, and the solar cycle here that says that when one generation passes away, another comes. When the sun goes down, it's the same sun, but it looks like a new one in the new day. And so there's this sense that, yes, we're a lost generation, but by reading this book, avoid the failures of this lost generation, and the next generation will learn to live more nobly. You could argue. Okay, well, let's get into this. Is a reading guide. By the end of this video tutorial, you should have a really good sense of, the trajectory of the novel, the relationships, the coda characters, the uncoda characters, some of the key concepts that Hemingway is developing here, like aficionado, like purity of line, those types of things. So I'm going to walk you through some key passages that you can look up in your book while you're going through this video, or pause and have a read of the page number I'm talking about. And I'm going to go through some key passages, so you have a really good sense of the trajectory of the novel and how to close read some of the passages. So in the beginning, we meet Robert Cohn. Robert Cohn is this Jewish Princeton graduate who really is a pawn for Hemingway's criticism. Here's a concept right away. He, still wears polo shirts. He still probably wears his college shirt. He is a case of arrested development, meaning that he hasn't really developed beyond college. He married the first woman who was nice to him after college, and that's a criticism, right? He didn't live it all. He is very much a pawn of others, and he falls in love with Lady Brett Ashley, who is this, British, beautiful woman whose husband also was a veteran of World War I and suffered from PTSD and slept on the floor with a gun in his hand. And so that has led Lady Brett Ashley to have a very cynical view of marriage, a cynical view of war, and has led to her sort of promiscuous lifestyle where she drinks too much, she wears her hair short, they call her a chap, and she approaches sexual intercourse and sexual relations as men do, as a stereotype. That is, she doesn't really have to be in a relationship to engage sexually with others. But Robert Cohn's in love with her. Robert Cohn is insecure with himself. He lacks confidence. But he does foolishly believe that he's going to marry Brett Ashley and be with Brett Ashley forever. He can't recognize reality. Well, in the conversations with Cohn's reading this book about South America and these romantic adventures. He wants to go have one. And then Jake says, the only one that really lives life all the way up, which is a great line from the book, are prize fighters and bullfighters. Okay? And that sort of prefigures Pedro Romero's entrance later in the novel, where he lives life all the way up. In other words, he takes great risks with his own life, but he's strengthened by his ability to be a bullfighter. Well, more on that later. Well, there's some important information. Jake is also in love with Lady Brett Ashley. So is Mike Campbell, a Scot, who will come in later in the novel. But Jake's relationship with Brett's been going on for a long time. And when Jake looks at himself in the mirror, he sees his war wound, which is a wound to the groin, which prevents him from being able to engage sexually with Brett Ashley. And that's why the line here, Brett only wanted what she couldn't have. And so Brett seems very shallow here in the sense that even though she loves Jake as a person, even though she goes to Jake for advice, even though she knows she can count on Jake for being there when she's in need, she cannot have sexual intercourse with her, and so she knows she ultimately wouldn't be satisfied with Jake. And Jake is looking at himself in the mirror, realizing this. Here's a comment on from Robert Cohn about Brett, and Robert Cohn seeing Brett with other men. I just couldn't stand it about Brett. I've been through hell, Jake. It's been simply hell. Now everything's gone. Everything. And that's obviously later in the novel, but it captures this idea that, Robert Cohn can't recognize the reality, and that Lady Brett does not need to be in a relationship. She's promiscuous, but he holds on to the foolish idea that they are in a relationship. So let's continue on. Let's look at the more important than the Robert Cohn Lady Brett Ashley relationship is the Brett Jake relationship. And here's a sense of the great dialogue in this book. It really shows the characters' mood, the characters' sense of morality. And here we go. So couldn't we live together, Brett? Jake asks. Couldn't we just live together? I don't think so. I'll just tromper you with everybody. That means I'll cheat on you in French. You couldn't stand it. I stand it now. That would be different. It's my fault, Jake. It's the way I'm made. And so, there's a sense there that Brett's just that way. It's part of her genetics to be promiscuous. And I disagree with that. I think it's part of the recognize her failed marriage and what war did to her previous husband. And now she doesn't want to commit herself and be broken in that way emotionally. And so she just engages sexually with others and not emotionally with others. But Jake continues, couldn't we go off in the country for a while? It wouldn't be any good if you go if you like, but I couldn't live quietly in the country, not with my own true love. I know. Isn't it rotten? There isn't any use my telling you I love you. You know I love you. Let's not talk. Talk's all bilge. I'll go away from you, and then Michael's coming back. Why are you going away? Better for you, better for me. When are you going? As soon as I can. Where? San Sebastian. It's a coastal town in Spain. Can't we go together? No. That'd be a hell of an idea after we just talked it all out. We never agreed. Oh, you know as well as I do. Don't be obstinate, darling. Oh, sure, I said. I know you're right. I'm just low. When I'm low, I talk like a fool. I sat up, leaned over, found my shoes beside the bed, and put them on. I stood up. Don't look like that, darling. How do you want me to look? Oh, don't be a fool. I'm going away tomorrow. So here we get, Brett, the tone here, she's got the upper hand. She knows, she knows she's in control. And what she's saying to him is, I can't be with you sexually, so I really couldn't be with you for good alone in the country. And you get that right about here. I couldn't be alone with my own true love. I know, isn't it rotten? There isn't any use telling you I love you. And so there's that sense that, we both know the problem here, even though we love each other. It's really sad. But he handles it much more maturely than Robert Cohn does, but still Jake has a long way to go maturing toward his relationship with Lady Brett Ashley. Let's look at a couple of Coda characters in this book. Count Mippopoulos, funny Greek name, is in love with Brett Ashley also. So you're getting the sense that here we have a love pentagon of sorts, more than a love triangle. But he emerges as a character who lives by his own values, and one of those values is to always be in love, and he loves Brett Ashley, and he doesn't let her promiscuity get in the way. And he says this about all the wars he fought in and about being in love. I've been in 7 wars and 4 revolutions, the Count said. Soldiering? Sometimes, my dear. And I've gotten arrow wounds. Have you ever seen arrow wounds? Let's have a look at them. So here, previous World War I, obviously, a war of rifles, machine guns, automatic rifles, and hand grenades, trench warfare, but Mippopoulos is talking about arrow wounds. The Count stood up, unbuttoned his vest, opened his shirt. He pulled up his undershirt and his chest back, his big stomach muscles bulging under the light. You see them? Below the line where his ribs stop were 2 raised welts. See on my back where they come out? Above the small of the back with two scars raised as thick as a finger. I say, they are something, clean through. The Count was tucking in his shirt. Where'd you get these? In Abyssinia, when I was 21 years old. What were you doing? Were you in the army? I was on a business trip, my dear. So there's that sarcasm, there's that acerbic tone, right? I told you he's one of us, didn't I? Brett turned to me. I love you, Count. You are a darling. So Brett loves people who are cynical, sarcastic. You make me very happy, my dear, but it isn't true. Don't be an ass. You see, Mr. Barnes, it's because I've lived very much that now I can enjoy everything so well. Don't you feel like that? And that's an important phrase, right? This book is about how to live. Remember that opening quote that I shared with you? It takes a lifetime to learn the simplest things, and it's the duty of man to leave behind what he's learned in his life. Well, because he's lived so much and seen so much tragedy and been in love and been broken in love, that he can enjoy everything so well. Yes, absolutely. I know, said the Count. That is a secret. You must get to know the values. Doesn't anything ever happen to your values, Brett asked. No, not anymore. Never fall in love? Always, said the Count. I am always in love. What does that do to your values? That, too, has got a place in my values. And so here we have, appreciation of all things in life, appreciation of being in love with Brett and not being hung up on the tradition of marriage. And so this is a model for Jake of sorts. He's going to get a better model with Pedro Romero, but the Count is a model of how to be in love and not be entangled with this foolish desire to change Brett, because she's not going to change. Hang on a second. I'm going to move this down a little bit. Well, this is a quote I wanted to share with you about, not only do they see horrors, the implied horrors of World War I in this novel that we saw in first-hand accounts in Farewell to Arms, but there's also injustice everywhere. And this is the great injustice everywhere quote, where Bill Gordon is recalling an experience while he was traveling around Europe, and he talks about this prize fight, and there was a wonderful, notice the racism here, wonderful nigger, looked like Tiger Flowers, only 4 times as big, he's telling Jake. All of a sudden everybody started to throw things, not me. Nigger just knocked the local boy down in the boxing ring. Nigger put up his glove, wanted to make a speech, awful noble-looking nigger. Started to make a speech, and the local white boy hit him. Then he knocked the white boy cold. Then everybody commenced to throw chairs, and nigger went home with us in our car. Couldn't get his clothes, wore my coat. Remember the whole thing now, big sporting event. What happened? So here we have, not only a description of racism, that you can't knock out a white prize fighter, but also a racist retelling of the racism by calling him a wonderful, noble-looking nigger, as if that's an anomaly, and obviously the racial epithet screaming through in this recollection. Well, what happened? This is Bill. I loaned the nigger some clothes and went around with them to try and get him some money. Claimed nigger owed them money on account of wrecking the hall. Wonder who translated. Was it me? Probably it wasn't you. You're right. It wasn't me at all. It was another fellow. I think we called him the local Harvard man. Remember him now, studying music? How'd you come out? Not so good, Jake. Injustice everywhere. Promoter claimed nigger promised to let local boy stay. Claimed nigger violated contract. Can't knock out a Vienna boy in Vienna. My God, Mr. Gordon, said nigger. I didn't do anything in there for 40 minutes. We tried to let him stay. That white boy must have ruptured himself swinging at me. I never did hit him. Did you get any money? No money, Jake. All we could get was nigger's clothes. Somebody took his watch, too. Splendid nigger. Big mistake to have come to Vienna. Not so good, Jake. Not so good. What became of the nigger? Well, he went back to Cologne, lives there, married, got a family, going to write me a letter and send me the money. I loaned him. Wonderful nigger. Hope I gave him the right address. And so I share that with you just because, this is like in our time, the pre-war, during war, post-war, there's violence everywhere. There's injustice everywhere. There's cruelty to the innocent everywhere. And here in this 1926 novel, the 1 year after the publication of In Our Time, Hemingway is doing the same thing. The implied injustices during the war that have scarred these soldiers, and now here there's this racism toward an African American who fought nobly in the prize ring, in the boxing ring. Well, Brett goes to San Sebastian, surprisingly, not with Mike Campbell, the Scot, who she's supposedly engaged to marry, and not with Count Epipopoulos, and not with Jake, but with Robert Cohn, much to Cohn's delight. And Jake is an important passage on 102, 103. Is walking, and he sees a church, and he goes in, and he starts to pray. And I think this is, an interesting passage for Hemingway because his mother was deeply religious. His father was a surgeon and went along with his wife's religion. But Hemingway himself never found religion to be helpful. But here he is sort of working out a prayer. And let's pause over this. At the end of the street, I saw the cathedral and walked up toward it. First time I ever saw it, I thought the facade was ugly, but I liked it now. I went inside. It was dim and dark, and the pillars went up high, and there were people praying, and it smelled of incense, and there were some wonderful big windows. I knelt and started to pray, and prayed for everybody I thought of. Brett, and Mike, and Bill, and Robert Cohn, and myself, and all the bullfighters, separately for the ones I liked, and lumping all the rest. Then I prayed for myself again. And while I was praying for myself, I found I was getting sleepy, so I prayed for the bullfights to be good. So not a very religious prayer here, and not necessarily thanking God for the chance for eternal salvation, but looking to have some good bullfights to watch. And then it would be a fine fiesta. This is Pamplona that they're all headed toward, and that we would get some good fishing. It's almost like a Huck Finn prayer here, right? Of a 13-year-old boy. I wonder if there's anything else I might pray for. And then I thought I would like to have some money, so I prayed that I would make a lot of money. And then I started to think how I would make it, and thinking of money reminded me of the Count. And I started wondering where he was, and regretting I hadn't seen him since that night in Montmartre. And about something funny Brett told me about him. And all the time I was kneeling with my forehead on the wood in front of me, and I was thinking of myself as praying. And I was a little ashamed and regretted that I was such a rotten Catholic. But realized there was nothing I could do about it, at least for a while, and maybe never. But anyway, it was a grand religion, and I wish I felt religious. That's a key line. I wish I felt religious. If you remember from Farewell to Arms, that love is a religious feeling. Love can give you that sort of signpost, that sort of guiding hand that religion provides for many. So Jake says, I only wished I felt religious, and maybe I would next time. And then I was out in the hot sun on the steps of the cathedral, and the four fingers and the thumb of my right hand were still damp, and then I felt them dry in the sun. It's a little bit delayed decoding here, right? Why are his hands wet? Well, he's touched the holy water and he's crossed himself. We don't know if he's crossed himself. We assume he has. Maybe he didn't feel religious enough to do that. But nonetheless, here's this. This will be a reoccurring image of drying in the sun from being wet. The sun was hot and hard, and I crossed over some buildings and walked along the side streets to the hotel. Interesting juxtaposition here with water. This is the holy water, the baptismal water, if you will. Here's at dinner that night we found Robert Cohn had taken a bath. So his version of baptism, and had shaved, and a haircut and a shampoo, and something put on his hair afterward to make it stay down. He was nervous, it goes on to say. And so, here's this desire for a religious feeling, desire for a purpose in life, a desire for a feeling of holiness, of cleanliness, and you have Cohn with the slick back hair, and both, I would argue, both Jake and Cohn at this moment unable to have a religious feeling or have a religious purpose to life. Jake is obviously jealous, resentful that Cohn has been able to experience Brett in San Sebastian. And then Jake's got to get out of this situation before they go to Pamplona. They're all going to meet in Pamplona for the running of the bulls. And so in the intermediary, Jake decides to go fly fishing up in the Basque Country above Spain, northern Spain. And, like a Bruzy here from, the mountain town of the priest in Farewell to Arms, he travels up to the Basque Country in this bus full of Basque peasants, but the country is clean, and it's cold, and it's orderly, and people are dignified, and they carry themselves with great pride. So here's this peasant wisdom. This is God's country, he says at one point. There's that connection between the desire to have religious feeling and these people living a clean, cold, orderly, dignified life. And he sticks a wine bottle in the water, again connecting with the holy water on his fingertips. Now his whole hand and wrist are in. It's really cold. So let's look at that passage. The trout fishing with Bill Gordon strengthens Jake by having an arena in which the principles of a process matter. Fishing projects morality into a physical experience. And so nature, as we know, often for Hemingway is a place, is an arena, is a context in which you can behave ethically, behave morally, and that strengthens them. So let's look at this. Say, he called up against the noise of the dam, that's Bill. I will put the wine in the spring up on the road. All right, I shouted, and Bill waved his hands and started down the stream. I found the 2 wine bottles in the pack and carried them up the road to where the water of a spring flowed out of an iron pipe. There was a board over the spring, and I lifted it, and knocking the corks firmly into the bottles, lowered them down into the water. It was so cold, my hand and wrist felt numb. Okay, so now he's getting more immersed in water. Water becomes really important in this book. I put back the slab of wood and hoped nobody would find the wine. I got my rod that was leaning on the tree and took the bait can and landing net and walked out of the dam. It was built to provide a head of water for driving logs. The gate was up, and I sat on one of the square timbers and watched the smooth apron of water before the river tumbled into the falls. In the whitewater at the foot of the dam, it was deep. As I baited up, he does do fly fishing later, a trout shot up out of the whitewater into the falls and was carried down. Before I could finish baiting, another trout jumped the falls, making the same lovely arc and disappearing into the water that was thundering down. I put on a good-sized sinker and dropped into the whitewater close to the edge of the timbers of the dam. So now he's in the water. I did not feel the first trout strike. When I started to pull up, I felt that I had one and brought him, fighting and bending the rod almost double out of the boiling water at the foot of the falls, and swung him up onto the dam. He was a good trout, and I banged his head against the timber so that he quivered out straight and slipped him into my bag. So this is, classic, like Nick Adams in A Big Throated River. This is physical immersion in nature. This is pouring yourself into the process of fishing. This is losing oneself in completing tasks well, code principle. And this is important to understanding Jake's emergence toward looking for a life that he can live by a code, by way of completing tasks well, outside of Bill, outside of Mike Campbell and Lady Bird Ashley and Robert Cohn and the others that bring him down. Interestingly, during this moment of fly fishing, he's also reading. He pauses to read, and what he reads about is really interesting, and it's right here. It was a little past noon, and there was not much shade, so I sat against the trunk of the trees and grew together and read. The book was something by A.E.W. Mason, and I was reading a wonderful story about a man who'd frozen in the Alps, had fallen into a glacier and disappeared, and his bride was going to wait 24 years exactly for his body to come out on the moraine, while her true love waited too, and they were still waiting when Bill came up. So, here's a dedication to love, waiting for this woman waiting for him in this love triangle, and it reminds Jake of what he doesn't have with Lady Bird Ashley, which I think creates a context for this, for the value of fly fishing here, of fishing here. So the sun dries Jake as his fingers dried from the holy water, and after he's half immersed in that trout stream, and then fully immersed from swimming. So here we have, first it was his fingers, desire for religious feeling, then it was his wrist with the wine bottles, and then his halfway up his body, and he dries in the sun, and then he swims, and he dries in the sun. So let's look at this. We stayed 5 days at Burgett and had good fishing. The nights were cold and the days were hot, and there was always a breeze even in the heat of the day. It was hot enough so that it felt good to wade in a cold stream. The sun dried you. There it is again. The sun dried you when you came up out and sat on the bank. Found a stream with a deep pool enough to swim in. In the evenings we played three-handed bridge, and an Englishman named Harris, who'd walked over from St. Jean-Pied-de-Port, however you say that, and was stopping at the inn for the fishing. He was very pleasant and went with us twice to the Roddy River. There was no from Robert Cohn, nor from Brett, and Mike. And so, no recollection, no remembrance of the love triangle, or the love pentagon, if you will. And great people who appreciate each other, who fish well, great weather, good fishing, lose yourself in the process. This is, I would argue, the life that Jake Barnes always wanted to live and wants to sort of translate into his life in town. When he gets to town, he gets to Pamplona, we find out that Jake is an aficionado. An aficionado is a fanatic whose deep knowledge allows him to appreciate action that adheres to a strict self-imposed code. So he's aficionado of bullfighting. He loves matadors. He can see things that are happening in a bullfight that others cannot. And the owner of the Hotel Montoya, Montoya himself, puts his hand on Jake and says, "Buen hombre, you're an aficionado. You know the difference between good and bad bullfighting." I think that's really important. Jake wants to be an aficionado about life, about how to behave well, about admiring those who behave well, like Count Mephipopolis, like Pedro Romero, the matador, and then apply that to his own life. And I think it's also important to look at this, that the Montoya is also ashamed that Jake has such horrible friends. So everybody's met in Pamplona. Brett's there. She's drunk on the train. Mike's there. Robert Cohn's there. Bill's there. Obviously Jake's there, and others are there. But let's look at this moment of being appreciated for being an aficionado. Montoya put his hand on Jake's shoulder. "I'll see you there." He smiled again. He always smiled as though bullfighting were a very special secret between the two of us. A rather shocking but really very deep secret that we knew about. He always smiled as though there was something lewd about the secret to outsiders, but that it was something that we understood. It would not do to expose it to people who would not understand. "Your friend, is he aficionado too?" Montoya smiled at Bill. Bill Gorton. "Yes, he came all the way from New York to see San Fermines." "Yes?" Montoya politely disbelieved. "But he's not aficionado like you." He put his hand on my shoulder again, embarrassedly. "Yes, he's a real aficionado. But he's not aficionado like you. Afición means passion. An aficionado is one who's passionate about the bullfights, or passionate about any spectacle or process. All the good bullfighters stayed at Montoya's hotel. That is, those with afición stayed there. Commercial bullfighters stayed once, perhaps, and then not come back. The good ones came each year. In Montoya's room, there were photographs. Photographs were dedicated to Juanito Montoya or to his sister. The photographs of bullfighters Montoya had really believed in were framed. Photographs of bullfighters who had been without afición, without passion, Montoya kept in a drawer of his desk. They often had the most flattering inscriptions, but they did not mean anything. One day, Montoya took them all out and dropped them in the wastebasket. He did not want them around. So this is important. Here's this foreshadowing of those without passion, those who do not live life all the way up, those who do not commit themselves to a cause and a process and do things well. Montoya has no place for them. They either go in the wastebasket or the back of a drawer. So obviously here, this is a model for what Jake should do. Get rid of the people in his life who don't live passionately, who don't live by a self-imposed code. Get rid of Brett, get rid of Mike, get rid of Cohn, but he doesn't. We often talked about bulls and bullfighters. I'd stopped at the Montoya for several years. We never talked for very long at a time. It was simply for the pleasure of discovering what we each felt. Men would come in from distant towns, and before they left Pamplona, stop and talk a few minutes with Montoya about bulls. These men were aficionados. Those who were aficionados could always get rooms, even in the hotel when the hotel was full. Montoya introduced me to some of them. They were always very polite at first, and amused them very much, and I should be an American. Somehow it was taken for granted that an American could not have afición, at least for bullfighting. He might simulate it or confuse it with excitement, but he could never really have it. When they saw that I had afición, there was no password, no set of questions that could bring it out. It's really important. Rather, it was a sort of oral spiritual examination with the questions always a little on the defensive and never apparent. There was this same embarrassed putting the hand on my shoulder or a buen hombre. But nearly always there was the actual touching. It seemed as though they wanted to touch you to make it certain. Montoya can forgive anything of a bullfighter who had afición. He could forgive attacks of nerves, panic, bad, unexplainable actions, all sorts of lapses. For one who had afición, he could forgive anything at once. He forgave me all my friends without his ever saying anything. There was simply a little something shameful between us, like the spilling open of horses in bullfighting. And so, even in bullfighting, this aficionado recognizes that there is, cruelty toward the innocent. And it's something that nobody talks about, and it's something you just tolerate, like having these immoral, uncoded people around. But what I think is important here is that Jake is an aficionado. He's a buen hombre. He has a group of individuals here at the Hotel Montoya who know that he has afición, that no set of questions could bring it out. It's just something, by the way that you talk about bullfighting, by the way you talk about the bullfighters, that one would just know. And so this is important to Hemingway's life, and important to the characters here. You have to live by a certain unspoken code, if you will, a way of behaving that shows your character and shows your passion. So some interesting things that come out of this passage is that Jake sees himself as a steer that are sent into the bull ring often to quiet down the bulls. And so obviously steers are emasculated. They can't procreate. That's actually the bull that we eat is our steers. And so they get gored by the bulls. And so here's Jake, the steer, trying to quiet down Mike Campbell, trying to quiet down Robert Cohn, trying to quiet down Count Mipopoulos. He's the emasculated steer in this bull ring of bulls who are trying to have sex with, and are having sex with, Brett Ashley. And then Brett comments that the steers do not look happy. And then a steer is gored, and Brett is fascinated by that. And she does not see the connection to Jake. Clearly, Jake does. One of the comments about the steers is that they never join the herd of bulls. And all of this is commentary about how Jake really will not join the herd of bulls, will hopefully take a pure line and get rid of these men from his life. And then Brett claims that Jake should not hang around like the steer, so finally she makes the connection that Jake is a steer and should get lost. But it's really difficult for Jake to do that. This is one of these great passages that's worth talking about. Just like the sharks are always coming in The Old Man and the Sea, there is a sense of despair that's always looming in Hemingway's texts. And so he wrote this. As a matter of fact, supper was a pleasant meal. Brett wore a black sleeveless evening dress. She looked quite beautiful. Mike acted as though nothing had happened. I had to go up and bring Robert Cohn down. This is after Robert Cohn gets in a fight with multiple people. Jake Barnes and Pedro Romero. He was reserved and formal, and his face was still taut and sallow, but he cheered up finally. He could not stop looking at Brett in the sleeveless black dress. It seemed to make him happy. It seemed pleasant for him to see her looking so lovely and know that he'd been with her and that everyone knew it. They could not take that away from him. Bill was very funny, so was Michael. They were good together. It was like certain dinners I remembered from the war. There was much wine and ignored tension, right? So the ignored tension of war is that they all might die the next day, but there's an ignored tension here that there's this love pentagon going on, and the feelings of things that coming that you could not prevent happening. Okay? So under the wine, I lost the disgusted feeling, and I was happy. It seemed they were all such nice people. So Hemingway had this great quote, I drink so much to make other people interesting, and certainly here's a passage about that. But the ignored tension here, not of war, but ignored tension of everybody's in love with Brett Ashley, and Brett can't commit to any one of them. And they're all going to be ruined, and it's coming, and they couldn't prevent that. They can't prevent that from happening. And then there's this great comment that the bill always comes for investing in women. Jake is looking for a way to live in the emotional and moral wasteland of post-World War I Europe. He rejects false philosophies. He wants to live by a self-imposed code, his own code, that other aficionados would appreciate. So that's important. He wants to conduct himself in such a way, like a bullfight, like a great matador, where aficionados would appreciate his great skill. He wants to live in such a way that others would appreciate how he conducts himself. All I wanted to know was how to live in it. Maybe if you found out how to live in it, you learned from that what it was all about. So this is one of those great quotes in the novel about really explicitly stating that Jake wants to develop a self-imposed code, and from that know what life is about. And then Brett's with Jake, and they're going down the street, and they see this church, and Jake says, maybe I should go make a confession, and makes the comment that if my confession would be in language you wouldn't understand, and that's because Brett doesn't have the ability to confess, doesn't have the ability to feel remorse. Nonetheless, Jake's still hanging around her. And then the fiesta at Pamplona explodes, and there's parades, and there's drinking, and there's people get lost, and there's the running of the bulls. The man gets gored and run over. It's just absolutely insane. But then we get this bullfight where Pedro Romero is this incredible matador, and Jake is trying to explain to Brett what makes him such a great matador, and this is the important concept of purity of line. So Jake is telling this to Brett. Other bullfighters twisted themselves like corkscrews, then leaned into the flanks of the bull after the horns had passed to give a fake look of danger. So they're sort of posers. After all that was fake turned bad and gave an unpleasant feeling to the observer. Romero's bullfighting had real emotion, because he kept the almost purity of line in his moments, and it was quietly and calmly let the horns pass him close each time. He did not have to emphasize their closeness. He did not have to pose or fake a look of danger. He was really in the terrain of the bull. So important lines here. Purity of line, maximum of exposure made him unattainable to the bull, unable to be destroyed by the bull. Jake's an aficionado. He's an aficionado of matador. He's an aficionado of those who have great passion and commit themselves to the process well and don't fake anything. But he can't apply that to his own life. He hasn't yet applied it to his own relationship with Brett Ashley. He hasn't exposed himself with a purity of line and maximum exposure to make him on the table unable to be ruined. He kind of skirts around with Brett and is willing to take her back in, even though he knows that ultimately won't end in marriage and won't end in a satisfying relationship. Well, no surprise here. Brett falls in love with Pedro, this 18-year-old matador, and wants to be with him. Pedro is exact and ethical in approaching this relationship with Brett because he looks at Jake before he to get the nod of approval that it's okay with him if he is with Brett Ashley. But then Pedro, they go to another bullfight, and Pedro wears down this bull that actually killed Vicente Girones. And as the tradition goes, they cut the ears and the tail off and present it to Pedro, and Pedro presents these to Brett Ashley. And here's what happens here with these tokens from the bull that murdered Vincent Girones in the running of the bulls. The bull who killed Vincent Girones was killed by Pedro Romero. His ear was cut by popular acclamation given to Pedro, who in turn gave it to Brett, who wrapped it in a handkerchief and left both ears in the handkerchief shoved far back in the hotel drawer. And so here is really, you could argue, an example of Brett's amorality, or her lack of feeling or understanding at all the feelings of others, as opposed to presenting to the ear to the family, to the grieving wife, the widow, and their children. She doesn't care about it, shoves it in the back of the drawer like it's a empty matchbox, or for her, an empty liquor bottle. And shows disrespect to Pedro, disrespect to the grieving family, and really captures her amorality well. Well, Cone can't stand the fact that Brett's with Pedro, so he was a prize fighter at Princeton, so he beats up Pedro. Cone does. Cone nearly killed the poor bloody bullfighter. Cone broke down and crying and wanted to shake hands with Romero, but Romero was rather good. He didn't say much. He kept getting up. He got knocked down again, so Romero hit him just as hard as he could in the face. Romero couldn't get up. He said that if Cone helped him, he'd kill him. Cone was crying, and Romero hit him in the face again. And so here's an example of, Pedro not winning the fight necessarily, but being unwilling to give up, not saying anything. And here's this uncoated Cone, wants to shake hands afterwards. He's crying. He's feeling sorry for himself, so he's not avoiding self-pity, one of those code principles. And then Pedro the next day has this bullfight where he did what he always did, smoothly, calmly, beautifully, and what Belmonte, an older bullfighter who fakes it, could only bring himself to do now sometimes. And in doing so, in fighting so well, he never looks up to the crowd that's cheering him, but it strengthened him. He's buoyed up by the crowd, he's carried on their shoulders and not by his legs and his shoulders, and he's embarrassed by that because he doesn't act as a matador well for the satisfactions of others. He does it to strengthen himself, to wipe out all the stuff with Brett. So here it is. Pedro Romero had the greatness. He loved bullfighting, and I think he loved the bulls, and I think he loved Brett, everything of which he could control. The locality he did in front of her all that afternoon. Never once did he look up. He made it stronger that way. And he did it for himself, too, as well as for her, but mostly for himself. Because he did not look up to ask if it pleased. He did it all for himself inside, and it strengthened him. And yet he did it for her, too, because he loved her. But he did not do it for her at any loss to himself. He gained by it all through the afternoon. And so this is what Jake doesn't have. Here, after Count Papopoulos, Pedro Romero becomes a role model, a coded role model for Jake Barnes. Pedro has the greatness, the ability to complete tasks well in the bullfight, and that strengthens him, and it wipes out all of the horrible stuff about being up by Cone. Let's go to the next. And so working the bull well and completing tasks well with the purity of line wipes out the fight with Cone, who had not touched Pedro's spirit. And so again, a really important moment here for for Pedro, that his spirit can't be ruined, his inner drive, his afición, his passion cannot be ruined because he completes tasks well. And then we have Jake leaving Pamplona, and swimming out beyond the breakers of the waves and going to the raft and being buoyant in the water. And it felt as if he could never sink. So like Pedro was being made buoyant by the crowd and celebrating him, Jake is now feeling, fully immersed in water here, feeling as if he could never sink, feeling that if he lives his life well, he will be, if you will, metaphorically lifted up on the shoulders of others and be appreciated. And Pedro wants to marry Brett to honor her and their love, and he has a purity of line with his relationship with Brett. Brett says, no, I'm not going to ruin you. I'm not going to be that bitch that ruins men and children. And so that is a role model for the last line, where Jake is in a taxi with Brett because Brett's in despair about, oh my gosh, I've lost Pedro, I'm a horrible woman, blah, blah, blah. And of course, Jake comes running to Brett's aid, and they're in the taxi cab, and this policeman is directing traffic with a baton. He lifts his baton up, sort of a phallic symbol, what Jake does not have, and then the driver slams on the brakes, and Brett is slammed into Jake, and he feels her close to her, and Brett says, oh, Jake, we could have had such a good time together. Yes, is Jake's final response. Isn't it pretty to think so? Pretty, a word that Hemingway hates and that Jake hates, right? A false abstraction. And so here's Jake finally committing himself, having a purity of line. He's in the train of the bull, if you will. He's making a clean break with Brett and saying, we cannot be together. We will never be together. I am going to make a break with you. And I think the presumption is, and you can ponder this and argue with me on the online discussion, that Jake will now live a life like Frederick that is more coded than it has been in the past. He's seen codelessness in Robert Cohn, in Mike Campbell, and Lady Brett Ashley, but he's going to conduct himself more like Count Papopoulos and more like Pedro Romero and live a life of afición, of great passion that others would admire.